Part 3. The Wasp's Nest. Chapter 14. Up on the Roof. "Oh, you goddamn fucking son of a bitch!" Jack Torrance cried these words out in both surprise and agony as he slapped his right hand against his blue chambray work shirt, dislodging the big slow-moving wasp that had stung him. Then he was scrambling up the roof as fast as he could, looking back over his shoulder to see if the wasp's brothers and sisters were rising up from the nest he had uncovered to do battle. If they were, it could be bad. The nest was between him and his ladder, and the trap door leading down into the attic was locked from the inside. The drop was 70 feet from the roof to the cement patio between the hotel and the lawn. The clean air above the nest was still and undisturbed. Jack whistled disgustingly between his teeth, sat straddling the peak of the roof, and examined his right index finger. It was swelling already, and he supposed he would have to try and creep past that nest to his ladder so he could go down and put some ice on it. It was October 20. When That's a weird way to write it, but okay. I'm guessing he means 20th. Wendy and Danny had gone down to Sidewinder in the hotel truck, an elderly rattling Dodge that was still more trustworthy than the VW, which was now wheezing gravely and seemed terminal, to get 3 gallons of milk and do some Christmas shopping. It was early to shop, but there was no telling when the snow would come to stay. There had already been flurries, and in some places the road down from the overlook was slick with patch ice. So far the fall had been almost preternaturally beautiful. In the 3 weeks they had been here, Golden Day had followed Golden Day. Crisp, I'm not crisp enough to pronounce it. 30-degree mornings gave way to afternoon temperatures in the low 60s, the perfect temperature for climbing around on the overlook's gently sloping western roof and doing the shingling. Jack had admitted freely to Wendy that he could have finished the job 4 days ago, but he felt no real urge to hurry. The view from up here was spectacular, even putting the vista from the presidential suite in the shade. More importantly, the work itself was soothing. On the roof, he felt himself healing from the troubled wounds of the last 3 years. On the roof, he felt at peace. Those 3 years began to seem like a turbulent nightmare. The shingles had been badly rotted, some of them blown entirely away by last winter's storms. He'd ripped them all up, yelling "Bombs away!" as he dropped them over the side, not wanting Danny to get hit in case he had wandered over. He had been pulling out bad flashing when the wasp had gotten him. The ironic part was that he had warned himself each time he climbed onto the roof to keep an eye out for nests. He had gotten that bug bomb just in case. But this morning the stillness and peace had been so complete that his watchfulness had lapsed. He had been back in the world of the play he was slowly creating, roughing out whatever scene he would be working on that evening in his head. The play was going very well, and although Wendy had said little, he knew she was pleased. He had been roadblocked on the crucial scene between Dinker. Ooh, crossover. Alright, listen to this. Before we go any further. In Apt Pupil, another book by Stephen King, this boy gets in league with this Nazi war criminal who, when he's hiding out in America, goes by the name of Arthur Dinker. So, here it is here, and that's fantastic. That it's linking to Apt Pupil. And also, Dick Hallorann is in it. He shows up in a flashback scene. I just wanted to point that out. I forgot about it. between Dinker, the sadistic headmaster, and Gary Benson, his young hero, during the last unhappy 6 months at Stovington, months when the craving for a drink had been so bad that he could barely concentrate on his in-class lectures, let alone his extracurricular literary ambitions. But in the last 12 evenings, as he actually sat down in front of the office model Underwood he had borrowed from the main office downstairs, the roadblock had disappeared under his fingers as magically as cotton candy dissolves on the lips. My nose itches. Everyone knows you can't read correctly if your nose itches. And it won't stop. He had come up almost effortlessly with the insights into Dinker's character that had always been lacking, and he had rewritten most of the second act accordingly, making it revolve around the new scene. And the progress of the third act, which he had been turning over in his mind when the Wasp put an end to Where's the people who can pronounce things effortlessly when you need them? Conjugate. No. Cogitation. We'll say that's it. It's probably not it, but we'll say it's it. It's thinking. He was thinking. Was coming clearer all the time. He was ruminating. That's what he was doing. Was coming clearer all the time. He thought he could rough it out in 2 weeks, and have a clean copy of the whole damn play by New Year's. He had an agent in New York, a tough red-headed woman named Phyllis Sandler, who smoked Herbert Territons, drank Jim Beam from a paper cup, and thought the literary sun rose and set on Sean O'Casey. Jesus Christ, these names. She had marketed 3 of Jack's short stories, including the Esquire piece. He had also written her about the play, which was called The Little School, describing the basic conflict between Dinker, a gifted student who had failed into becoming the brutal and brutalizing headmaster of a turn-of-the-century New England prep school, and Gary Benson, the student he sees as a younger version of himself. Can you smooth out my tongue a little bit? Just a little bit. I have no idea why I took these off. Shit. And it's difficult to get them back on with one hand. Alright. Phyllis had written back expressing interest and admonished him to read O'Casey before sitting down to it. She had written again earlier that year asking where the hell was the play. He had written back wryly that the little school had been indefinitely and perhaps infinitely delayed between hand and page, and that, quote unquote, in that interesting intellectual goby known as the writer's block, unquote. Now it looked as if she might actually get the play. Whether or not it was any good or if it would ever see actual production was another matter. But he didn't seem to care a great deal about those things. He felt in a way that the play itself, the whole thing, was the roadblock, a colossal symbol of the bad years at Stovington Prep, the marriage he had almost totaled like a nutty kid behind the wheel of an old jalopy, the monstrous assault on his son, the incident in the parking lot with George Hatfield, an incident he could no longer view as just a sudden and destructive flare of temper. He now thought that part of his drinking problem had stemmed from an unconscious desire to be free of Stovington, and the security he felt was stifling whatever creative urge he had. He had stopped drinking, but the need to be free had been just as great. Hence George Hatfield. Now all that remained of those days was to play on his desk in his and Wendy's bedroom, and when it was done and sent off to Phyllis's hole-in-the-wall New York agency, he could turn to other things. Not a novel. He wasn't ready to stumble into the swamp of another 3-year undertaking, but surely more short stories. Perhaps a book of them. Moving warily, he scrambled back down the slope of the roof on his hands and knees past the line of demarcation where the fresh green bird shingles gave way to the section of roof he had just finished clearing. He came to the edge on the left of the wasp nest he had uncovered and moved gingerly towards it, ready to backtrack and bolt down his ladder to the ground if things looked too hot. He leaned over the section of pulled-out flashing and looked in. The nest was in there, tucked into the space between the old flashing and the final roof undercoating of 3x5s. It was a damn big one. The grayish paper ball looked to Jack as if it might be nearly 2 feet through the center. Its shape was not perfect, because the space between the flashing and the boards was too narrow, but he thought the little buggers had still done a pretty respectable job. I'd just like to point out before I continue, it's a lot harder to read it out loud because you're focusing on what you're saying instead of reading it in your head. So, sure, it takes up a lot of time, but it's really fun to do. And a lot of people give me positive. I can't even speak now. A lot of people have given me positive feedback on it, so I'm really glad you're enjoying it so far. Because it's only going to get better. It's kind of slow right now. A lot of foreshadowings happen, but you won't really get that until later on. The surface of the nest was a crawl with the lumbering, slow-moving insects. They were the big mean ones, not yellow jackets, which are smaller and calmer, but wall wasps. They had been rendered sludgy and stupid by the fall temperatures, but Jack, who knew about wasps from his childhood, counted himself lucky that he had been stung only once. And, he thought, if Ullman had hired the job done in the height of the summer, the workmen who tore up that particular section of the flashing would have gotten one hell of a surprise. Yes, indeedy. When a dozen wall wasps land on you all at once and start stinging your face and hands and arms, stinging your legs right through your pants, it would be entirely possible to forget you were 70 feet up. You might just charge right off the edge of the roof while you were trying to get away from them. Off from those little things, the biggest of them only half the length of a pencil stub. He had read someplace, in a Sunday supplement piece or back of the book news magazine article, that 7% of all automobile fatalities go unexplained. No mechanical failure, no excessive speed, no booze, no bad weather. Simply one car crashes on deserted sections of road, one dead occupant, the driver unable to explain what had happened to him. The article had included an interview with a state trooper who theorized that many of these so-called foo crashes resulted from insects in the car. Interesting. Wasps, a bee, perhaps even a spider or moth. The driver gets panicky, tries to swat it or roll a window to let it out. Perhaps the insect stings him. Maybe the driver just loses control. Either way, it's bang, all over. And the insect, usually completely unharmed, would buzz merrily out of the smoking wreck, looking for greener pastures. The trooper had been in favor of having pathologists look for insect venom while autopsying such victims, Jack recalled. The gist. Now looking down into the nest, it seemed to him that it could serve as both a workable symbol for what he had been through, and what he had dragged his hostages to fortune through, and an omen for a better future. How else could you explain the things that had happened to him? For he still felt that the whole range of unhappy Stovington experiences had to be looked at with Jack Torrance in the passive mode. By the way, if you're coming up with metaphors and things like that for what's going on, don't. It's going to do it itself. I promise. We're about to find out. We're talking about insects, and I'm being attacked by flies. Um, he had not done things. Things had been done to him. He had known plenty of people on the Stovington faculty, two of them right in the English department, who were hard drinkers. Zach Tunney was in the habit of picking up a full keg of beer on Saturday afternoon, plonking it in a backyard snowbank overnight, and then killing damn near all of it on Sunday watching football games and old movies. Yet, through the week, Zach was as sober as a judge. A weak cocktail with lunch was an occasion. Sorry. He and Al Shockley had been alcoholics. They sought each other out like two cast-off who were still social enough to prefer drowning together to doing it alone. The sea had been whole grain instead of salt, that was all. Looking down at the wasp as they slowly went about their instinctual business before winter closed down to kill all but their hibernating queen, he would go further. He was still an alcoholic, always would be. Perhaps had been since sophomore class night in high school when he had taken his first drink. It had nothing to do with willpower, or the morality of drinking, or the weakness or strength of his own character. There was a broken switch somewhere inside, or a circuit breaker that didn't work, and he had been propelled down the chute willingly. Hold on. I gotta find my charger cord. Here it is. Come on. Alright. He had been propelled down the chute willingly, slowly at first, and then accelerating as Stovington applied its pressures on him. A big greased slide, and at the bottom had been a shattered, ownerless bicycle, and a son with a broken arm. Jack Torrance in the passive mode. And his temper, same thing. All his life he had been trying unsuccessfully to control it. He could remember at 7, spanked by a neighbor lady for playing with matches. He had gone out and hurled a rock at a passing car. His father had seen that, and he had descended on little Jackie roaring. He had reddened Jack's behind, and then blackened his eye. And when his father had gone into the house, muttering to see what was on television, Jack had come upon a stray dog, and had kicked it into the gutter. There had been 24 fights in grammar school, even more than in high school, warranting 2 suspensions and uncounted detentions, in spite of his good grades. Football had provided a partial safety valve, although he remembered perfectly well that he had spent almost every minute of the game in a state of high piss-off, taking every opposing block and tackle personally. He had been a fine player, making all-conference in his junior and senior year, and he knew perfectly well that he had had his own bad temper to thank, or to blame. He had not enjoyed football. Every game was a grudge match. And yet, through it all, he hadn't felt like a son of a bitch. He hadn't felt mean. He always regarded himself as Jack Torrance, a really nice guy who was just going to have to learn how to cope with his anger someday before it got him in trouble. The same way he was going to have to learn how to cope with his drinking. I figured I'd turn off the TV instead of actually muting it. Saves money. But he had been an emotional alcoholic just as surely as he had been a physical one. The two of them were no doubt tied together somewhere deep inside of him, where you just as soon not look, but it didn't much matter to him if the root causes were interrelated or separate, sociological or psychological or physiological. But he had had to deal with the results, the spankings, the beatings from his old man, the suspensions, the trying to explain the school clothes torn in playground brawls, and later, the hangovers, the slowly dissolving glue of his marriage, the single bicycle wheel with its bent spokes pointing into the sky, Danny's broken arm, and George Hatfield, of course. He felt that he had unwittingly stuck his hand into the great wasp nest of life. As an image it stank. As a camo of reality he felt it was serviceable. He had stuck his hand through some rotted flashing in high summer, and that hand and his whole arm had been consumed in holy righteous fire, destroying conscious thought, making the concept of civilized behavior obsolete. Could you be expected to behave as a thinking human being when your hand was being impaled on red hot darning needles? Could you be expected to live in the love of your nearest and dearest when the brown, furious cloud rose out of its hole in the fabric of things, the fabric you thought was so innocent, and arrowed straight at you? Could you be held responsible for your own actions as you ran crazily about on the sloping roof 70 feet above the ground, not knowing where you're going, not remembering that your panicky stumbling feet could land you crashing and blundering right over the rain gutter and down to your death on the concrete 70 feet below? Jack didn't think you could. When you unwittingly stuck your hand into the wasp's nest, you hadn't made a covenant with the devil to give up your civilized with its trappings of love and respect and honor, civilized self with trappings of love and respect and honor. It just happened to you, passively, with no say. Passively, with no say, you ceased to be a creature of the mind and became a creature of the nerve endings, from college-educated man to wailing ape in 5 easy seconds. He thought about George Hatfield. Tall and shaggily blond, George had been regularly an insolently beautiful boy. In his tight faded jeans and Stubbington sweatshirt, with the sleeves carelessly pushed up to the elbows to disclose his tanned forearms, he reminded Jack of a young Robert Redford, and he doubted that George had much trouble scoring, no more than that young football-playing devil Jack Torrance had it 10 years earlier. He could say that he honestly didn't feel jealous of George or envy him his good looks. In fact, he had he had he had almost unconsciously began to visualize George as the physical incarnation of his play hero, Gary Benson, the perfect foil for the dark and slumped and aging Dinker, who grew to hate Gary so much. Basic story of apt pupil. It's a story of parasitism. They begin to hate one another, but can't live without one another. I just ruined the story. No, I didn't. Um, but he, Jack Torrance, had never felt that way about George. If he had, he would have known it. He was quite sure of that. George had floated through his classes at Stubbington, a soccer and baseball star. His academic program had been fairly undemanding, and he had been content with C's and an occasional B in history or botany. He was a fierce field contender, but oh no, a lackadaisical, amused sort of student in the classroom. Jack was familiar with the type, more from more from his own days as a high school and college student than from his teaching experience, which was at second hand. George Hatfield was a jock. He could be a calm, undemanding figure in the classroom, but when the right set of competitive stimuli was applied, like electrodes to the simple Slow down, smooth it out. Like electrodes to the temple of Frankenstein's monster, Jack thought wryly. He could become a juggernaut. In January, George had tried out with 24 others for the debate team. He had been quite frank with Jack. His father was a corporation lawyer, and he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. George, who felt no burning call to do anything else, was willing. His grades were not top end, but this, after all, was only prep school, and it was still early times. If should be came to must be, his father could pull some strings. George's own athletic ability would open still other doors, but Brian Hatfield thought his son should get on the debate team. It was good practice, and it was something that law school admissions boards always looked for. So George went out for debate, and in late March Jack cut him from the team. The late winter inter-squad debates had fired George Hatfield's competitive soul. He became a grimly determined debater, prepping his pro or con position fiercely. It didn't matter if the subject was legalization of marijuana, reinstating the death penalty, or the old depletion allowance. George became conservative, and he was just jingoist enough to honestly not care which side he was on, a rare and valuable trait even in high-level debaters, Jack knew. The soul of a true carpetbagger and a true debater was not far removed from each other. They were both passionately interested in the main chance. So far so good. But George Hatfield stuttered. This was not a handicap that had even showed up in the classroom, where George was always cool and collected, whether he had done his homework or not, and certainly not on the Stubbington playing fields, where talk was not a virtue, and they sometimes even threw you out of the game for too much discussion. And I'm going to have to stutter, like intentionally stutter, so this is going to be fun. When George got tightly wound in a debate, the stutter would come out. The more eager he became, the worse it was. Oh, well, this shouldn't be a problem for me then. The more eager he became, okay. And when he felt he had an opponent dead in his sights, an intellectual sort of buck fever seemed to take place between his speech centers and his mouth, and he would freeze solid while the clock ran out. It was painful to watch. So I think we have to say that the facts in the case, Mr. Dorsky, sites are rendered obsolete by the recent decisions handed down in the buzzer would go off and George would now I can't stop. The buzzer would go off and George would whirl around to stare furiously at Jack who sat beside it. George's face at those moments would be flushed. His notes crumpled spasmodically in one hand. Jack had held on to George long after he had cut most of the obvious flat tires, hoping George would work out. He remembered one late afternoon about a week before he had reluctantly dropped the axe. George had stayed after the others had filed out, and then had confronted Jack angrily. You set the timer ahead. Jack looked up from his papers he was putting back in the briefcase. George, what are you talking about? I didn't get my whole 5 minutes. You set it ahead. I was watching the clock. The clock and the timer may be kept. The clock and the timer may kept. Yeah. The clock and the timer may keep slightly different times, George, but I never touched the dial on the damn thing. Scout's honor. You did. The belligerent, I'm sticking up for my rights way George was looking at him had sparked Jack's own temper. He had been off the sauce for 2 months too long, and he was ragged. He made one last effort to hold himself in. to hold himself in. "I assure you I did not, George. It's your stutter. Do you have any idea what it causes? You don't stutter in class." "I don't stutter." "Lower your voice. You, you want to get me. You don't want me on your goddamn team." "Lower your voice," I said. "Let's discuss this rationally." "Fuck that. George, if you can control your stutter, I'd be glad to have you. You're well prepped for each practice and you're good at the background stuff, which means you're rarely surprised. But all that doesn't mean much if you can't control that." "I never stuttered," he cried out. "It's you. I if someone else had the debate team, I could." Jack's tem- Ja- Jack's temper slipped another notch. "George, you're never going to make much of a lawyer, corporation or otherwise, if you can't control that. Law isn't like soccer. 2 hours of practice every night won't cut it. What are you going to do? Stand up in front of a board meeting and say, now, gentlemen, about the tort?" He suddenly flushed, not with anger, but with shame at his own cruelty. This was not a man in front of him, but a 17-year-old boy who was facing the first major defeat of his life, and maybe asking, in the only way he could, for Jack to help him find a way to cope with it. George gave him a final furious glance, his lips twisting and bucking as the words bottled out behind him struggled to find their way out. "You, you set it ahead. You, you hate me, but because you know, you, you know." With an articulate cry, he rushed out of the classroom, slamming the door hard enough to make the wire-enforced glass rattle in its frame. Stuttering is incredibly hard to do intentionally. Jack had stood there, feeling, rather than hearing, the echo of George's Adidas in the empty hall. Still in the grip of his temper and his shame at mocking George's stutter, his first thought had been a sick sort of exhalation. For the first time in his life, George Hatfield had wanted something he could not have. For the first time there was something wrong that all of Daddy's money could not fix. You couldn't bribe a speech center. You couldn't offer a tongue an extra 50 a week and a bonus at Christmas if it would agree to stop flapping like a record needle in a defective groove. Then the exhalation was simply buried in shame, and he felt the way he had after he had broken Danny's arm. "Dear God, I'm not a son of a bitch. Please." The sick happiness at George's retreat was more typical of Dinker in the play than of Jack Torrance the playwright. "You hate me because you know." Because he knew what? What could he possibly know about George Hatfield that would make him hate him? That his whole future lay ahead of him. That his whole future lay ahead of him? That he looked a little bit like Robert Redford? Now I'm getting too much into the character, with the stuttering character. That he looked a little bit like Robert Redford, and all conversation among girls stopped when he did a double gainer from the pool diving board. That he played soccer and baseball with a natural, unlearned grace. Ridiculous. Absolutely absurd. He envied he envied George Hatfield nothing. If the truth was known, he felt worse about George's unfortunate stutter than George himself, because because George really would have made an excellent debater. And if Jack had set the timer ahead, of course he hadn't, it would have been because both he and the other members of the squad were embarrassed for George's struggle, and they had agonized over it the way you agonize when the class night speaker forgets some of his lines. If he had set the timer ahead, it would have been just to put George out of his misery. But he hadn't set the timer ahead. He was quite sure of that. A week later he had cut him, and that time he kept his temper. The shouts and the threats had all been on George's side. A week after that he had gone out to the parking lot halfway through practice to get a pile of source books that he had left in the trunk of the VW, and there had been George, down on one knee with his long blond hair swinging in his face, a hunting knife in one hand. He was sawing through the VW's right front tire. The back tires were already shredded, and the bug sat on the flats like a small, tired dog. Jack had seen red, and remembered very little of the encounter that followed. He remembered a thick growl that seemed to issue from his own throat. Very important. All right, Jack, if that's how you want it, just come here and take your medicine. What? Take your medicine? Take your medicine? Isn't that familiar? All right. Remember that. Remember that. He remembered George looking up, startled and fearful. He said, "Mr. Torrance," as if to explain how all this was just a mistake. The tires had been flat when he got there, and he was just cleaning dirt out of the front treads with the tip of this gutting knife he just happened to have with him, and Jack had waded in, his fists held up in front of him, and it seemed that he had been grinning, but he wasn't sure of that. The last thing he remembered was George holding the knife and saying, "You better not come any closer," and the next thing was Miss Strong, the French teacher, holding Jack's arms, crying, screaming, "Stop it, Jack! Stop it! You're going to kill him!" He had blinked around stupidly. There was the hunting knife glittering harmlessly on the parking lot asphalt 4 yards away. There was his Volkswagen, his poor old battered bug, veteran of many wild midnight drunken rides, sitting on 3 flat shoes. There was a new dent in the right front fender he saw, and there was something in the middle of the dent that was either red paint or blood. For a moment he had been confused. His thoughts, Jesus Christ, Al, we hit him after all, of that other night. Then his eyes had shifted to George. George lying dazed and blinking on the asphalt. His debate group had come out and they were huddled together by the door, staring at George. There was blood on his face from a scalp laceration that looked minor. There was also blood running out of one of George's ears, and that probably meant a concussion. When George tried to get up, Jack shook free of Miss Strong and went to him. George cringed. Jack put his hands on George's chest and pushed him back down. "Lie still," he said. "Don't try to move." He turned to Miss Strong, who was staring at them both with horror. "Please go call the school doctor, Miss Strong," he told her. She turned and fled toward the office. He looked at his debate class, then looked them right in the eye. He looked at his debate class then, looked him right in the eye because he was in charge again, fully himself. And when he was himself, there wasn't a nicer guy in the whole state of Vermont. Surely they knew that. "You can go home now," he told them. "We'll meet again tomorrow." But by the end of that week, 6 of his debaters had dropped out, 2 of them the class of the act. But of course it didn't matter much because he had been informed by then that he would be dropping out himself. Yet somehow he had stayed off the bottle, and he supposed that was something. And he had not hated George Hatfield, he was sure of that. He had not acted, but had been acted upon. "You hate me because you know." But he had known nothing. Nothing. He would swear that before the throne of Almighty God, just as he would swear that he had set the timer ahead no more than a minute, and not out of hate but out of pity. Two wasps were crawling sluggishly about on the roof beside the hole in the flashing. He watched them until they spread their aerily dynamic, unsound but strangely efficient wings and lumbered off into the October sunshine, perchance to sting someone else. God had seen fit to give them stingers, and Jack supposed they had to use them on somebody. How long had he been sitting here, looking at that hole with its unpleasant surprise down inside, raking over old coals? He looked at his watch. Almost half an hour. He let himself down to the edge of the roof, dropped one leg over, and felt around until his foot found the top rung of the ladder, just below the overhang. He would go down to the equipment shed, where he had stored the bug bomb on a high shelf out of Danny's reach. He would get it, come back, and they would be the ones surprised. You could be stung, but you could also sting back. He believed that sincerely. 2 hours from now, the nest would be so much chewed paper, and Danny could have it in his room if he wanted to. Jack had had one in his room when he was a kid. It always smelled faintly of wood smoke and gasoline. He could have it right by the head of his bed. It wouldn't hurt him. I'm getting better. The sound of his own voice, confident in the silent afternoon, reassured him, even though he hadn't meant to speak aloud. He was getting better. It was possible to graduate from passive to active, to take the thing that had once driven you nearly to madness as a neutral prize of no. I'm so close to finishing this chapter. It was possible to graduate from passive to active, to take the thing that had once driven you nearly to madness as a neutral prize of no more than occasional academic interest. And if there was a place where the thing could be done, this was surely it. He went down the ladder to get the bug bomb. They would pay. They would pay for stinging him. Let me say that again. For no reason. He went down the ladder to get the bug bomb. They would pay. They would pay for stinging him. That was better. I'll be right back with chapter 15. Pages now. And we're on page 115 of I just want to get. There's 447 pages in this book. We're halfway down 115. So we're getting there. Alright?